the situation on the battlefield is actually rather mixed, and that the Russians aren't doing very well in Kursk, where the Ukrainians have made an incursion to their country, or around Pokrovsk, which is a major target, but are doing better in Chasiv Yar and one or two others. So I think it's a very complicated situation. I think Russia's taking huge casualties for minimal gains, and that will be a concern to Putin.
Does the war between Russia and Ukraine now have the characteristics of a global conflict? President Putin says so, and next week, NATO representatives and Ukraine will meet to discuss the latest developments. This evening, Ukrainian military officials have confirmed the use of British Storm Shadow missiles. Well, joining me now is Christopher Steele, former head of the MI6 Russia desk. Good evening, Christopher.
Hi, Kathy.
What do you make of those differing interpretations you've just heard? Where do you stand on it?
My view is that there's no risk of this World War III breaking out anytime soon. I think the war obviously has seen various escalations taking place, but actually, of late, it's been Putin that's escalating by bringing in North Korean troops onto the battlefield and by using a new hypersonic missile against a civilian target in Ukraine yesterday. So I think we cannot allow Putin to get away with this rhetoric. And indeed, we need to be prepared to up our game in support of Ukraine over the next few months. I think the other sort of imponderable here really is the arrival of Donald Trump back in office in January, which may well have sort of made Putin more confident and more daring. But I don't think that this represents a particular escalation on the West side, not least because these missiles only have a range of a couple of hundred miles. So the idea that they're going to be striking deep into Russia, Moscow, St. Petersburg is not accurate.
Nevertheless, Putin is sending a clear message that Russia will respond to what it perceives as Western aggression and the West getting involved in the war. What do you make of Nina Krasheva's suggestion, we should take Putin seriously, take him at his word potentially, even though red lines have been crossed in the past?
Yes, red lines have been crossed many times, as you know, in relation to aircraft and tanks and so on being supplied by the West. And I think it's basically comes down to the essential arguments about deterrence. If we let Putin get away with this, if we allow him to have some sort of victory over threats he makes, or indeed some settlement in Ukraine, the consequences for that going forward are horrendous for us and for NATO. I don't believe that Russia is about to attack the NATO states. I don't think it has the strength to. And in fact, they've been taking huge casualties of late, making incremental gains in Ukraine. So I think we have to stand up, as we did in the past during the Cuban Missile Crisis and other situations, where we probably sent the wrong messages out about weakness on our side, possibly disunity, and stand up to a bully. That's the only way to deal with him.
Right, and you mentioned in your first answer about needing to support Ukraine further in the coming months. Does that mean that Keir Starmer needs to do more? He's talked about making clear what he's going to do in terms of the defence spending commitment to bring that to 2.5% of GDP. A lot of people saying, well, it actually needs to go to 3%. Does he need to bring that forward and make clear a sort of greater military spending commitment than he has done so far?
I think we obviously need to be spending at least 2.5% of our GDP on defence. But I think there are more fundamental problems that need addressing, and they're going to take several years to correct. And one of them is our military industrial capacity in Europe, and in particular in Britain, which has been allowed to decline. So I think we have to learn the lessons from history here and make sure that we have the capacity to surge production and military industrial capability, depending on the threat that comes from Russia. And whilst Russia at the moment is not in a fit state to attack NATO, in 5 years' time it might be, and we have to bear that in mind.
Well, and talking about that threat, we've seen things that could possibly be linked to Russia trying to sow chaos or instability. For example, explosions at postal depots. I wondered if you draw a line between that and, these security scares that we've seen at Gatwick. Do you think there's any possibility of Russian involvement somewhere down the line?
Absolutely. I don't know enough about the incident at Gatwick today to make a clear judgment, but clearly the things that involve asymmetrical warfare, as we call it, the sort of grey zone of warfare, which involve things like cyber attacks and planning attacks on individuals, potentially dissidents in the country, as we've seen before with Skripal and Litvinenko, and indeed potentially cutting things like undersea cables, which connect us to other countries and are essential for our economy. All of those things are conceivable as Russian responses, and we have to be incredibly kind of aware of that and prepared to counter it. But I do not see Russia as having either the capability or the intent really to launch a major scale war against NATO. It's having its work cut out in Ukraine. Indeed, although there's a lot of talk at the moment of Russia making gains on the battlefield, the situation, as far as I understand from the latest information we have, is that the situation on the battlefield is actually rather mixed, and that the Russians aren't doing very well in Kursk, where the Ukrainians have made an incursion to their country, or around Pokrovsk, which is a major target, but are doing better in Chasiv Yar and one or two others. So I think it's a very complicated situation. I think Russia's taking huge casualties for minimal gains, and that will be a concern to Putin.
And just finally and briefly, if you would, you mentioned Donald Trump coming back to power. Donald Trump well. The Russian situation well. What intelligence are you getting about how Putin is sort of preparing for that? What he's expecting and what he's likely to get from a second Trump presidency?
I don't think either the Russians or the Ukrainians know exactly what to expect from Donald Trump, and his position on issues changes quite rapidly, as you know. I think there will be an attempt by him to set up some kind of deal, but I feel that the deal won't really be what the Russians or the Ukrainians will find acceptable. Because in the case of the Russians, this is not really a war about territory. It's a war about sovereignty. It's a war about the self-determination of Ukraine going forward, the whole country. And it's not a matter of Donald Trump saying, Russia, if you take this part of land and this resource and this asset, will you settle the war? Will you declare peace? I think they're going to talk past each other. And I don't really see a deal that's going to be durable in Ukraine coming about anytime soon, I'm afraid. And I think this war will continue for the next 3 to 6 months at least.
Christopher Steele, former head of the MI6 Russia desk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There's irresponsible rhetoric coming from Russia, and that is not going to deter our support for Ukraine. We're now on day 1,000 of that conflict. That's 1,000 days of Russian aggression, 1,000 days of sacrifice in Ukraine. We have stood with Ukraine from the start, and I've been doubling down in my clear message that we need to ensure that Ukraine has what is needed for as long as is needed to win this war against Putin.